Thank you, David. After that introduction, I don't know whether I should be burned at the stake. That's a tall order to fill, but thank you also very much for the invitation to be here, especially for bringing this day in which I'm to talk. On the other hand, I had read the weather report before I came and realized that it's very cold here. It was snowing several days ago, and so I have all these wool clothes, scarf, a hat, and yet this day is just wonderful. I appreciate your coming on such a wonderful day to listen to talk. And you should be outside. All of us should be outside. How is this in terms of acoustics? All right. Fine. On the other hand, you've set for me an impossible task, because I know I'm supposed to talk about social construction and psychotherapy. Some of you come here as therapists. You know a lot about therapy and probably not very much about social construction. Others have probably had a background in social construction but not therapy, and some people are here without background in either. And I don't know how I'm going to talk with you all at the same time, but I'm going to try. Oh, and I was told beforehand that I should really concentrate on the relational part of this, which wasn't in the title. So I'm going to try to weave that in as well. What I'm going to do, I think, is talk a little bit about social construction, just to spell out what page we're on. I give a whole course in it, so you're going to get the 7-minute variety. Then I'm going to talk, I think, about therapy as it's realizing constructionist ideas to a short degree, but not a lot, because not all of you are practicing therapists. And then to try to work into this relational area, which becomes larger than therapy. It becomes more like, what are we doing with our lives? All right, social construction. Let me put this kind of brazenly, that in terms of something we want to know about, that we want to examine, that we want to observe, that we want to make sure we have good knowledge about, there isn't anything to be said about mental illness, about human suffering, about psychotherapy, about causes and cures. That those are not in the world, out there, waiting to be observed, waiting to be studied, something that we can know more and more about, generate knowledge about, go back and correct the knowledge in a sort of an empiricist way so that we can finally get it straight so that therapy can be effective. Now, how could I say such a thing? I mean, many of us base our lives on the notion that we are doing therapy and it is dealing with human suffering and there is mental illness and there are causes of mental illness and there are what we will call cures. So obviously this is out of the question. Let me put it another way. Let's approach this another way. Who am I? What am I? Now, if you're a biologist, you can come and look at me and you can say a lot about me in terms of my biological makeup, my neurological, my biochemical makeup, and so on, my nervous system, and so on. We have a lot of language and a lot of study. And if you're an atomic physicist, you would begin to say something else about me, which wouldn't be biological. And if you were a psychoanalyst, you could begin to talk about my repression and my defense mechanisms. And if you were a clothing stylist, you'd realize I don't have on the right fashions for this year. And if you were a spiritualist, you might worry about the nature of my soul and its condition. Now all of these are developed vocabularies, highly developed vocabularies. They allow people to do a lot of things, from save me for Jesus to cure some ill which I might have. But ask yourself, what would I be outside of any of those vocabularies? Where do those vocabularies come from? They didn't come from just observing me. There's nothing about me in observation that would lead you to say, ah, there is biochemistry in action. Those vocabularies come out of some sort of group, some sort of tradition, an enclave, a community of practitioners of some kind. People who speak a particular kind of language, who do a certain kind of thing, experimental observation, some kind of work with my head, some kind of work with my soul or my clothing. They're communities of practitioners which want to do something with me, which have a goal, a value in mind. Now once you've got a community that's got some kind of thing they want to do with me, you begin to develop a language, practices. You begin to develop me as somebody, something, thing. I come into being as what I am by virtue of who you are, by virtue of the community in which you exist. And if you don't exist in any community, what am I? In one tradition, it's a paraphrase, you can understand me from one or another perspective. But outside of any perspective, what is there to say? In effect, by participation in some kind of community, something comes into being what it is for us, comes to have the value it does for us, comes to be something that we can study and know about within that tradition. This, what I'll call space here, is nothing. We don't even, it's just scarcely in existence for us. Now, if I had brought with me a troupe of modern dancers and said, hey, look, I want you to perform a little bit here and try to illustrate what I'm saying, they would have scoped this out. It would have probably a name. Well, let's name this space A, that will be space B, that will be space C, and what we're going to do is relate those three spaces with each other, blah, 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 blah. We could even give them names. It becomes something. It becomes a space in which we've got to do a performance related to you. Outside of any tradition, again, what is there to say? What is there to do? That's not I'm not talking here about a mind-world relationship. In fact, let me suggest that the whole mind-world relationship, the relationship between an in here and an out there, is already a reality only within a tradition. The whole problem of epistemology, how out there gets in here, is not a real problem. It's a problem only because we come out of a tradition in which we generate the reality of a mind and generate the reality of a world. And once we're in those two realities, then we start asking these puzzling questions about how one got inside the other. Outside the tradition, we don't have to ask the question. So in effect, the sort of bottom line of constructionism is that the world comes to be what it is for us through relationship, through participation with each other. And the radical view would be to say it's not only the language that we have that names things in the sort of Buddhist fashion, it's not simply the distinctions, it's how we come to relate to it. Once you have labeled it or named it mental illness, and once you become a therapist, then there's a certain kind of practice that becomes part of that, And it becomes a whole way of life. It becomes institutionalized or socially constituted as a tradition. And to push it further, it's to say that, and you can, I'm going to leave time, by the way, for a half hour of questions and comments and discussion. Let me press it hard. There is nothing of value, nothing worth doing, nothing of interest, nothing of importance, nothing of ultimate concern for us outside of participation in relationships. That is the genesis of everything, the genesis of every value, of every desire, is to be located within relationship. You can see here sort of a fundamental shift in ontology from an individual to relationship. And just so you get a little bit clear about it, I'm not trying to tell you the truth. I'm participating in a relationship with a lot of words, which I hope become action, which become practice, not because it's true, and I finally got the real word, but because perhaps it has some utility. Perhaps it can take us in some directions that we haven't gone before. That if we could move away from an individual-centered conception of the world, things in isolation, individuals as separate, that if we understood everything as coming out of relationship, we would prize relationship over individuals. We would look to the character of relationships. We would honor them. We would care for them in ways that perhaps we haven't so well in the past. And by the way, that same logic would apply to not only to individual persons, but to groups, to communities, to nations, to religions, virtually any other unit that we've tried to circumscribe and say, ah, there's a thing in itself. Okay, that's an in brief social relation course, or a social construction course. Now let me try to apply that in several directions. One, looking past in a certain way, and then present and future, but the first one, the past. A lot of the work that's come out of social construction thus far, and I would say the dialogues on social construction, because it's no one person's theory, obviously, nor is it a theory that everybody subscribes to as if you could lay out the 5 suppositions which every social constructionist would carry. It is a set of dialogues that are in continuous motion, to which everyone can participate. And there are no, in this sense, no social constructionists, because it's a way of talking, a way of doing. It's not a credo or a commitment like I believe in some truth which we all have to subscribe to. It's rather a way of going on that may be of some utility. Not a matter of believing. What is that to do? What is it to believe something? Say, I'm not going to speak any other words. Not like that. It's something to take on, try out, use it. Don't live it every moment, because it's only one language among many. But it's a language, I think, has got enormous possibilities for us. Okay, here's the past. A lot of the constructionist work has been pretty much critical, because as the constructionist dialogues developed, it largely was used as a kind of critique of, well, in some global sense, of a modernist tradition since the Enlightenment, which wanted to make declarations of truth, foundations of knowledge, foundations of rationality, which was very much involved with individualism. It became very much part of the, you might say, the postmodern critique of modernism. And that, I would say that 90% of constructionist sort of scholarship up until about 10 years ago was pretty much critical. But just so you know see how that goes and can apply it, just to kind of get a feel for it. I'm going to jump on one of my pet ponies for a few moments. Mental health, classifications of illness. Now it's very interesting. Let's say there isn't any schizophrenia in itself. All right, beginning there. There is no bipolarity in itself. There's no depression in itself. Those are all constructions that we've generated. But realize that we haven't had those constructions. Well, even a century ago, almost none of that language existed. It's only within the last century that we've really had a problem of mental health as we understand it now. If you go back a century and look at the classifications for psychological problems, there were only, at least in the West, about a dozen of these. One way in which they can have a problem is not agreeing with the terms, that is resisting them. It's very interesting because if you watch the development of that terminology from about a dozen to 400, it's been pretty much equivalent to watching the growth of mental health professions and the amount of income spent on mental health. It just begins to go upward as sort of in a concerted way. Now, why not? If we were talking about construction, whoever thought they were going to be depressed? We didn't have a word for it. Well, I'm feeling kind of down today. You wouldn't go to a therapist for that. Well, I've got the blues. Hell, you'd sing a song about that. You wouldn't go to a therapist. But if you've got another term which is coming out of the authoritative tradition of psychiatry, which says, hey, look, all that's folk terminology. What you really are is depressed. You say, well, it's down, that's sort of what I call myself, but I must be depressed. Therefore, I need a therapist, and the profession grows. And as the profession grows, so does the language. And as the language grows, so do we have more ways to count ourselves mentally ill. Where does that stop? What is going to be the stopping point for that cycle? Only the questioning of somehow the non-professionals, because the professionals have a stake in sustaining the nosology. That's income. Now, there are a lot of professionals who resist it. Family therapists are very resistant. But the number is minuscule in comparison to the impetus to keep classifying. And now, of course, the new player in this game are the drug companies, because it's enormously profitable for you to classify yourself as having a mental illness because they have just the drugs for you. And these are profitable. And they're in the pipeline now. There are new drugs always under development to improve on the range of things that can be handled by drugs. ADHD, we didn't have it 20 years ago. Now I have about 1 in 10 of my students are on drugs for ADHD. Hard to get them off. They didn't even know they had a problem. They weren't suffering. Parents felt like, well, they're not paying attention. You must have a mental disorder. Teacher agrees, they get them classified, and now it's almost a prestige item, because if you get Ritalin for your mental disorder, you get extra time on the SATs, you get special dispensation for taking exams, extra time, you get to take it in a private room, and so on. So there are now parents who are saying, who will pay to have the classification made, or who, if they don't have the money, are claiming they're unjustly discriminated against because their kid's not on Ritalin. I don't know, I mean, this is a plaintive critique, but I don't know how to stop that cycle. And once you've got drug company money in it, where do you go? I spoke at a psychiatry meeting last year. 1 in 4 of the people who were there were drug salesmen. When you arrive at a psychiatry meeting, the first thing I was given was a suitcase with a drug seal on it to take home with me all the things that drug companies were going to give me, because they have booths and you go around and they just give you wonderful gifts and you just put them in the suitcase. I mean, there's so much money there. Anyway, I don't have a solution to that, but my feeling is that somehow dialogue has got to get started, serious dialogue on that issue. I mean, that's one of our futures, and we can participate in that. Okay, that's the space of critique, just as an exemplification of how that might go. Let's take second round. Therapy now. Now, in terms of social construction, those dialogues have played through a lot of the therapeutic community, not all of it, and I think it largely comes out of the family therapy, social work, less out of clinical psychology, and very little out of psychiatry. But for those of you here, I think most of you know a lot about narrative therapy. Is that right? Is that sort of a thing you do? Well, narrative therapy is only one of a family of therapeutic orientations, which is part of the dialogue in constructionism. It's a practice which has been engaged with that dialogue. It draws from it in certain ways. So is brief therapy, solution-oriented therapy, collaborative therapy, postmodern therapy, reflexive therapy. All of them draw from constructionist dialogues. They realize them in different ways. Most of those therapies are not very content with diagnostic classifications because they're quite aware that these are pretty much constructed classifications. They're not generally so concerned with getting, let's say, to the bottom of what the person's problem is inside the head. As you might say from a psychoanalytic tradition, they're not so concerned with, let's say, repressed material from some other era of one's life. They're not so taken with the notion, the very notion of the problem, because they realize the problem has in some way been constructed and can be dissolved. And they're typically very concerned with the language that's being used either to construct one's life or how it might be changed, as in re-narrating, for example, as not talking about the problem so much as the solution, and so on. So all these therapies draw, in some sense, in an important way from constructionism. They're, in some sense, realizations of various sorts of ideas that are there. And I cherish them all. I'm engaged with dialogues with these people a lot. But just to make this a little bit sharper, rather than just championing, let me just talk for a few minutes about what I see as emerging dangers within those particular realms, because a lot of you are going to be involved with them or confront them. Just a few minutes of that. One, I lament the tendency to form schools. That is, to have narrative therapists, or brief tendency to form schools. That is, to have narrative therapists, or brief therapists. And that's what I am. Because if we're working in language, and you only have one way to talk, you are highly limited in the kinds of things you can do with anybody. If all you're going to do is talk about solutions, it's a pretty narrow conversation. If all you can do is talk about re-narrating, it's a less narrow conversation, but it's still circumscribed. Now I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes just to unfold it, but if you want to talk about it afterwards, we can. What I see is any school that begins to narrow the possibilities for what you may be within the therapeutic relationship is a danger. In a sense, it cuts down on the possibilities of doing anything important with the person, or narrows the range or scope of those with whom you can do anything. Secondly, and by the way, I think that these, what I'm calling the dangers, tend to be sort of left over from the whole therapeutic tradition, where you had to have schools, and if schools combated each other, and which one was the best school. I mean, we have it still today. I mean, we've had it from Freud and onward. And this now becomes institutionalized, of course, in laws of what gets third-party billing, whether you do psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral and so on. They're like all these attempts to circumscribe. I don't want to see that sort of constructionist orientation get enveloped in that, but rather to fight that orientation. That is sort of a studied eclecticism would be our best of root. Secondly, there's a tendency in those theories, even though they come out of a social constructionist base, to still be pretty personally oriented. The family therapists try to get away from it, but it's still difficult, partly for the practical reasons the whole families don't like to come in. And often you're pretty much going to do individual therapy. All together, but the tendency is to one-to-one therapy. Now, because that is the tendency, there's also a tendency to draw again from the therapeutic tradition to focus on that person's issues, my story, my possibilities. That is, to focus on what you're going to say, how it's going to unfold as I talk to you about yourself. In a sense, then, there's a way in which the therapy tends to want to privilege continuously the individual as opposed to that set of relationships in which that person lives. Not complete, but it moves in that direction. Narrative therapy tries to get out of it by trying to embed the new narrative within the complex set of relationships, which I think is a good move. But as I will argue later, I don't think it's sufficient. Thirdly, there's a still, and again it comes out of the old traditions, a way of trying to reach a cure or a point of improvement that is like the culmination. A new narrative. I have now restored, boom. I have now got the solution. I mean, it comes again out of that medical tradition which says, here's the illness, we can cure it. Failing to realize that from my perspective, that dialogue continues to go on. And that person comes out of the office and they enter into a whole set of relationships and things continue to move on. The issue gets redefined, reworked, continuously in conversation. Is not, I think, a stopping point where you can say, now it's finished, life goes on really well. Life goes on, but it bumps around pretty much. And to me, this is going to read my last point, somehow I feel as if the move has got to be made not to the content of, let's say, the news story or my solution or what's wrong with us and how we've got it solved. Has got to be with the possibility for engaging in the process in a more viable way. Now, what does that mean? If I'm generally oriented in a conversation to the content, and let's say I'm having an argument with my spouse, and I don't think that's right, she doesn't think I'm right. Well, let's say she's come in and given me a shot, criticized me for something I think is quite just. Ever happened to you before? I say, I was kind of irritated. wrong. This is really a good thing I'm doing. And sometimes the heat will turn up a little bit. No, you're wrong. I mean, it's like, don't you see the problem you've got, blah, blah. And as the heat turns up, I'm inclined, because of the content, now I've not only been told something I think is just, is unjust, and wrong, and horrible, and immoral, or something, but I've got somebody who's nagging at me about it incessantly, and so given that content, what is a person to do? But, now you can see the problem here. You've got just you've got a choreography which the end point of which is not good. The end point of that choreography is probably you're not going to speak to each other for a while, because you're going to say some things you regret. Now that choreography we inherit from the past. It's there as a part of our traditions. It's content oriented, and it seems natural. Somebody attacks you for something you think is right, you counterattack. Just what else is there guy to do? Almost genetic, isn't it? Fight and flight. You get attacked, you're either going to fight it or run away. Isn't that genetic? Well, no, it's not genetic. Those are just choreographies. They're choreographies that we inherit from the past. And the problem is not to get into the content, but into the way of how can you step out of that choreography so it doesn't lead in a direction which leaves you not speaking, or in the case of marital violence, hitting each other. It's a problem of how to go on in the midst of a heated discussion and realizing this is not really a good direction for us to be going in. How do you do it? And that's not just always natural. In fact, we don't have very good ways in the Western tradition. We don't have very good ways to step out of it. Therapists have found some ways. I mean, I love, and I think this comes out of the therapeutic tradition. I'm not absolutely certain, but that's the first place I've heard it. It's the meta move, which says, in the middle of a heated discussion, which is going to be catastrophic, the simple question of, why are we doing this? We don't want to do this. We don't want to have this fight. Why are we doing it? Now that's a good move. That's it. In terms of a creation of a living thing that a way of practicing is a really wonderful move. It's simple, but a lot of people don't have it. I didn't for a long time. It was only as sort of coming into constructionism that it became sort of obvious. It's the way we're talking that partly leads us into our problems. The content that we presume is real begins to lead us into problems, and we don't have to be there. You can step out of the whole reality and ask about the nature of why that reality. There's nowhere you have to be in terms of the constructed world. So that's been very helpful, and that to me is, again, one of the limits. If you ask what a client gains from therapy, just in terms of practice, what are they taking away? They're taking away some use of language, what we call insight, but how much are they taking away in terms of practice, beneficial action? I'm not going to answer that question. It's just raising the question of how could we understand therapy as providing new forms of action which people could use in ongoing relationships which aren't going well. How do you do a friendship? That's not so easy. How do you carry out a love relationship? It's just not natural. All these forms of relationship which we value don't come growing in the genes. They require some actual practice. How do you do it? And that's what I would love to see those therapies begin to move toward. There's more practice-oriented things that I can do. One of the reasons, by the way, that I really like a lot of Buddhist practices. I'm very sort of interactive with a number of Buddhist therapists now. Partly because those meditative practices are things, they're takeaways. They're not insights, they're ways of stopping when it all gets to be too much. When it just, you can't go on. It's a way of, I mean, Buddhism is like a major, or meditation is like a major deconstructive effort. It deconstructs the reality. It says, hey, step back, breathe, go into no mind. Don't be there. In that sense, deconstructing the realities in which one is living long enough in order to be able to sort of get back in the game, but in a different way. So I like those practices in a way, even though they're not verbal, they are meaningful, and they're de-meaningful. Okay, enough about therapy. Let me see where the time is going. Yikes. Can I talk more than 10 minutes? I mean, I'm just getting to the new part. All right. I'll tell you where I am now. I do a lot of what we'll call theory, but I don't look at it as theory, again, trying to tell you the truth about anything, but trying to work with ideas that may have some practical utility. So I try to keep them pretty much to things that I can act out. And if my wife and Mary were here, we would try more to act these out than me telling you about them. But I spend a lot of time now thinking about the nature of relationship out of which things become meaningful and what that would mean to us. I'm going to give you just a little bit of that as a preliminary and then try to move into a conception of the person. I mean, we inherit a tradition which says that the meaning is here. That's not meaningful to me, or I mean to say, whereas meaning is something in the head which I try to put into words. But you could tell from the early demonstration, hey, how did meaning ever get there in the first place? Why did something become distressful? We wouldn't have a problem of low self-esteem if we didn't think the self was somehow something we should guard and cherish and make the best it could be. I mean, we come from a whole tradition which generates a whole problem of low self-esteem or loss of control and thus depression. Depression exists within a meaning system. So where did we ever get that meaning system? Well, you can't start with the individual because the individual didn't have it there, right? You couldn't observe the depression. So how do you get it? So you've got to come out with something like this. Let me give a demonstration. I talk. I'm, blah, 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 blah. Words. What do they mean? Now, if you try to get into my head and ask what they mean, you'll never get there. There's no way you can penetrate the words and get into my skull to find out where meaning is hidden. That's it. In fact, the very idea of understanding is problematic in the first place. If understanding you means I can get past the words into some kind of subcortical or cortical event, you'll never understand anyone. A whole hermeneutical problem. It's impossible to solve. But I talk, and what happens? Well, some of you probably aren't here about a third to half to maybe 2/3 of the time, late afternoon. I think some of you may be taking a snooze for all I know. And I might as well not have been talking. They don't mean anything. It just sounds in the air. Some of you, I hope, are going to be critical. Don't believe that. It's a problem. I'm going to fight that one. I mean, you should. After all, we live in a tradition that's pretty strong. So what I mean is wrong. I mean, I've been saying problematic things. You turn them into something. Some of you are going to hit on a piece. You're going to hit on a phrase, a metaphor, a line of thought. Oh, that's something I've been trying to put into words too. That's something I can use for XY project that I'm working on. I can see how I can make that into practice. Now realize that I could provide the words, but I don't know what you do with them. And until you do something with them, they don't mean anything. They're just sounds in the air. I can provide the action, but until you provide the supplement, which brings them into meaning for what they aren't anything. You can demolish them, as in questioning. You can say it's all rubbish, and it is, because everything that can be said can be undone from some other perspective, or if you're a literary theorist, you can show that none of it means what it says. It always means something else. You can do that. You can take something away and say, hey, that really is useful to me, but you've made me into somebody who's been useful. I didn't do that. So until there is that action and the supplement, nothing has happened. You couldn't take anything away until I gave it to you. I couldn't give you anything until you took it. You just can't, before I said the first word, disagree. Don't think that's right. That doesn't make any sense. Disagreement doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have any meaning until there's something that has been said. So there is no disagreement in itself. It's only disagreement within a relationship where the other person has danced with you to give you, in some sense, the right to disagree. So in some sense, in that sense, you've given me the privilege of making meaning. And I've given you the privilege of taking it somewhere. And without that collaborative action, the action and supplement, the action-supplement combination, there isn't any meaning. So the fundamental unit, in this sense, is not me and my words and my thought. It's not you and your words and your thoughts. It's a me-you relationship. You take them apart, neither is sensible. Got to be together. Now realize also this is, I'm trying to get away from cause-effect here, where I do something to you and you do something back. Because the whole very idea of cause and effect is already to make me separate from you. It's already to create a world of difference. Blah, 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 and they impinge on each other. And why do we want that as a way of thinking about things? That leads to all sorts of issues of am I caused by you, or are you causing me to do something, and so on. And just abandon that for a time. The whole idea of cause and effect, put it on a shelf. Try to think everything emerging out of relationship, and that may not only be a relationship between the me-you, but we also ultimately are going to have to include some things like microphones and air and so on. But that's going off into another topic. Now, if you could take that on for a moment, let's just take a dyad for a moment, and that is, we're engaged in that process of generating meaning together out of that process. Look at it for a moment like gracefully. As an oval, as a process out of which a conception of you and me will emerge. We will become somebody in that process, but the process precedes the individual. All right, if you can take that on for a moment. Now, what do I take away from that process? This will go back to the therapy session for a minute. Part of what I'm going to take away is who you are in that relationship. That is, I'm going to go away with some kind of potential to be you. And this is pretty I mean, this is pretty familiar territory. It's a territory of modeling, identification. It's a territory in which, I mean, we pretty much have been there in the literature for 90 years in terms of child development. We take on the potentials to be the other. I'm not talking about stamping in and causing. I'm talking about incorporating and adding to my potential to be what you are. So that a lot of what I do, all the words I'm using are not mine, are they? I mean, they're all from somewhere else. Probably the way I'm standing is not mine. I didn't make it up. Not simply the you whom I become, because I'm also positioned in that relationship to be a certain kind of person. So I had a sort of a Prussian father. It was pretty tough because he had 4 boys and we were kind of hell to live with. And so he got tougher and tougher in order just to keep us under control. I didn't realize he was a really nice guy until we all left home. I thought, hey, this is really a nice man. But he wasn't. And he had bellowing voice, and that voice, when it came, I was like, you know, this little kid. I was like really frightened. So I know how to do fright. I know how to do hiding. I know how to do lying. Good defense. Because they were all useful within that relationship. So I also have those. I have the you. I have now the me I have become as part of a potential. And I've got a third thing, which is a choreography of how we do this together. I mean, think here of a dance for a moment in which, yeah, I've learned how to do the male thing, but when I was a kid and had to go, oh, this is a story. All right, I didn't know how to go to dances when I was like 12, 13, you know, kids were going to dances and I couldn't go. I couldn't perform the dance, like doing love or doing friendship. I needed to perform the dance. So I had to go to dancing school and I had to be the girl. Turned out that the dancing lesson just, I mean, they don't teach you anything that's useful, except that you're supposed to have confidence to start, and then you learn it. People are making it up pretty much all the ways. Anyway, that's what. Okay, so I now can do the male part, I can do the female part, but I can also do the dance, how it goes to do that together, which is the third thing, the third piece. So I come away from any relationship carrying a lot of traces of potential. Again, they're not determined. I'm part of them. I have collaborated to create them. So if you look at it that way, now I carry a huge compendium of potentials. I come into this relationship realizing some of those potentials for you. 98% of it's left out. If you look at it in this way, and if you carry on those relationships, by the way, to all the vicarious relationships you've had, all the films, the books that you've read, the religious pamphlets and so on, all that's there too. Even if you don't like it, it's there. Everyone here can play the part of a tyrant. Everyone here can play the part of a prejudiced person. Everybody has that potential. Everybody here can be a horror, a terror. We all have that potential. And it can be elicited, I would dare say, by just simply changing the value of it. So we all have the potential to do the most dreadful things. And what generally doesn't allow us, or at least the reason we don't, is not because we shouldn't or wouldn't do them, is because we're in other relationships. This is to say that fundamentally we come together, if you want to put it in those ways, incoherent and in full conflict. with many, many, many possibilities which conflict with each other and which make no sense. So that whole idea of the self growing into this mature being who puts it all into coherent space is sort of a Cartesian notion of a perfect person, man. It's pretty much, in this case, misleading. In some senses, a Freudian idea, except what we're not doing is say there are biological bases for repressions, and they're sort of limited, and everybody's got the same ones, and they're somehow to limit or repress those urges is in some way dysfunctional or neurotic. It's saying it's just a normal way of life. And yes, you've got to somehow find ways to avoid whole areas of what you are could possibly do, or you can't live in polite society. It's to say for everything that we value, we don't value it. For everything we desire, we don't desire it. For everything you love about a person, you can find some things to hate. That the potentials are there, for good or ill. For good or ill. I could go on, I just don't have time to do all this, but we could talk about the ill parts. Let me carry over just to talk about some of the good parts. Let me talk again about therapy for a moment. And again, it's not just about therapy because it's our lives together. Therapist comes, now we've got another whole set of embedded relationships. They generate now the meaning, the action supplements. Now look at the possibilities. Going back to the idea of therapeutic schools, if you have a school, a way of doing therapy, a single way of therapy, I've often liked to look at these as wings, which you can fly. The wings come down to very few. I can ask you questions and answers. It's a question and answer session. That's the dominant language in therapy, is questions and answers, and maybe some advice. That's highly limiting in terms of what the other person can become. He can, or she can become the ill person with all the problems. So play out roles. I'm going to be the person who asks you the questions, and you're going to be the person who responds in deep ways, and out of that somehow is going to become something else, which is one of these other relationships, or more of them. Look at therapy, and this is borrow a little bit of Maturana, but misusing him from his perspective, as a coordination of coordinations. That is, it's a coordinated activity which somehow has got to relate to these coordinations here in a way that they become different. So it's not effective, again, to just provide words as the person modeling you. Not effective simply to use a certain number of words. Not effective to simply concentrate on the individual's problems. Somehow it's got to work into this nexus of connection in a way that the whole relational nexus becomes altered in some way or transformed. 10% of it will hate you, and about 2% of that will want to kill you. Some of that's dangerous. And the research was about how could you identify those particular people in advance so you could perhaps do something about it. It's an interesting project. But in going into this project and trying to understand what was going on, I had a lot of case studies. And of those dozen case studies, you realize that nobody in those, well, let's say all the people who were lethal stalkers didn't know anybody. I mean, they didn't have any connection. They didn't live with family, didn't live with children, spouse, partner. They lived alone, and they pretty much lived in the media. So they're very much into television, movies, magazines, and so on. Now at that point you realize that they're pretty much free to live in a certain kind of relationship because there's nothing to balance it. They've, in some way, moved out of the relational matrix. It's not a restoring that's needed. It's not a bolstering of their self-esteem somehow. You've somehow got to find ways of bringing them back into the kind of meaning-making process that's going to allow them to reestablish a conscience, which is the voice of others. Conscience is living within the multiplicity of voices so that one can reflect on the other. The constant reflection of voices, of relationships, one with the other, to keep one within a sort of viable society and having a viable life. Now, what's required there is to do that. What kind of voice of the therapist is required to bring that disengaged person back into connection? How can I have a real connection with you, not listening to you, not so you can project on me, but actually having a vital connection with you, laughing, crying, caring, all those possibilities that bring people into what we'll call interdependence. Now let me just contrast that with one other, because I like the story attached. Let's say you've got also, in a common case, somebody who's in a narrative, not that they're disengaged, they're so engaged in a particular form of relationship that they can't get out of it. Take a case of somebody who's been raped when they were small or young. Somebody who's had a horrible circumstance and can't get past it. Just keep reliving it over and over and over again. Can't extricate themselves. Can't communicate outside of that. How then to break into that reality? How then to become somebody for them? How to get out of that particular recycling of the same issues? All right, I'll tell the story and then I'm going to stop because I could just go on because I like this story. Okay, this is my friend Edgardo, and he's a therapist in Puerto Rico. And early in his career, he had a young woman who came in who had been confined in a hospital, who didn't speak to anybody, hated everybody, came in, didn't want to be with him, and just sat there, had jet black hair, and sort of goth idiom. Sat in the chair, didn't want to be in Edgardo's room. He tried to, do the therapeutic thing by saying, well, look, I'm only here to help you, and I'd love to talk with you and be of any help I could, and all the sincere, wonderful things one said. Not a word. Not a word. So Edgardo had a little bit of other information about her, and one thing he knew is that she had a cat. And so he said something like, well, I hear you have a cat. And she still didn't say anything, but he noticed her mouth move a little bit. Almost. So Edgardo then says, okay, well, I have a cat. And, I have this really trouble with this cat because when I go home at night, I have a lot of work to do. I'm trying to write a book, and I sit there at my desk, and that cat's kind of angry watching me at the writing and not paying attention to him. And I'm sitting there at the desk, and Edgardo gets up on the desk that he's in the room, the therapeutic room, and he says, my cat's very naughty because when I'm there trying to write, and then he jumps up on the desk and goes, yeah! And he's on the desk now, having screamed out his meow, and the girl says, you're crazy! And Edgardo says, yes, but I get paid for it. And then the girl laughed, and they started to talk. I'd say this in part, it's a dramatization, but what about opening the range of potentials, the range of voices, the range of drama that breaks into the cycle? Certainly that's not the only way, but it's just to illustrate the expansion of the potentials so that that relationship becomes a coordination with broad impact. I'm sorry I talked too long, but now it's your turn.
Dr. Gergen, we've heard a lot of stuff about illuminating stuff about relationships, but by definition, a relationship entails a relationship to a term.
To a term?
To a term, or if you like, an object or a person or something like that. In other words, just by using the rhetoric of relations, yeah.
Yeah, we generally understand the relationship between at least two things or objects or persons is how can you have a relationship without entities? Now, the problem, in part, and I don't want to perseverate on this because it's kind of a philosophic point for this group, but I mean, we inherit a language of nouns in which we understand the world. That's just part of our everyday parlance is use nouns. How would you step out of it? How would you explain anything without nouns? But nouns are automatic division mechanisms. They chop the world up into pieces. Now, I can't make sense to you outside of using the language, so I'm rather stuck with that language where I really want to deconstruct it by, and I was trying to tie us together as the action supplement. If I were trying to do it in language, I would have action/supplement, just so that they're elided with each other. I mean, it's Heidegger's problem as well. It's like being in the world, where you get dashes, because you don't want to separate the being from the world, at least in the sort of ultimate ontological scheme of things. So, we inherit that. But I'm trying to get us into a way of thinking about the relationships as the logical prior to having anything we would call the thing which is in it.
Could you just elucidate that? I don't want to get us into philosophy, but I really don't see how you can construct a relational system without starting with nouns. And another point I want to make is you must be familiar that within cognitive psychology there's a strong, powerful tradition. I'm thinking of people like Fodor, who believe in a brain language, and this has recently got very powerful amplification and support from a woman called Ruth Milligan, whose point, as far as I can see, is there is an ultimate mental language where the nouns aren't arbitrary.
Well, look, I mean, once you go into the space I tend to be talking from, you ask yourself, look, to make a system like that is going to be a construction. And we can do it. But do you want to live in that construction? Do you want to live in the world it creates? Do I want to live in a world where I think that you are biologically or genetically determined to do anything you do?
I wasn't talking about determination.
Yeah, or to live in any world that is systematized to the point that somehow that scaffolding has got to be, well, what? Worshipped or...
I do if the kind of research that is turned up in brain studies is going to help my mother's amnesia. I'm fine listening to you down cry causation until it's a matter of life and death or being serious. If I go down to the local hospital, I want causation and I want a lot of it.
Yeah. All right, but realize, and I can understand that and appreciate it, but that's because you're willing to crawl into a system because you're part of the culture where that provides you with a useful outcome within that system's definition. In the same way that you want to go to, well, let's say, a therapist and get some kind of drug for your depression because that's what you do, because that's a biologically determined effect. Now, what constructionism does is not say, hey, that's wrong, let's abandon all that, that that's somehow incorrect. It says, recognize it for tradition and ask yourself, if at all times you want to live in that tradition. Do you want to live in a tradition necessarily, for example, where your only definition of death is biological? Because that's a very constraining kind of definition. Do we have to live there? Do we have to live in a world in which all pain is noxious, that is something to be avoided? That's a very sterile way of looking at what we call pain. So it's not to say, let's abandon all the traditions where cause and effect and systems and neurology are important, but simply to look at it as one way of moving, and one which we might want to call into question given other kinds of relationships and traditions in which we could access.
I'm going to try to overcome a little bit of a phobia to speak publicly in English. But I wanted to express first a sense of gratefulness that I have for the ideas that you have been exposing to us. And I have been fortunate enough to read your ideas since 1993 and have tried to integrate them in my work as a psychotherapist. And I believe one of the ideas that has been the most useful for me is, for example, a metaphor. And this metaphor is to try to flirt a little bit longer with uncertainty, which is something I have learned, something that has comforted me, but something that I want to define in many ways. And this image of myself trying to encounter new people, to meet clients, to meet people, person, in their context, in multiple contexts, and keep walking on the edge of these very hilly mountains and enjoy the constant imbalance that it creates. And I really, for me, this is the essence of trying to work from a postmodern stance. And as you so very well mentioned, it's not an escape from activity, it's not an escape from intervention at times, but it also means that intervention is relative in the sense that what's the use of an intervention if it's not used by the client, or if it has no efficacy, or if it's not heard in the proper way? And there are three words that really ring for me that are mostly powerful in my practice, and I had the privilege to work in Los Angeles County with probably one of the most difficult populations that one can encounter, and use those ideas in an extremely generative mode, with gangsters, for example, and I didn't think we could co-create conversation. I felt like I was an alien coming from a different world, and yet I had the luxury and the privilege to make conversation that transformed my life. And the notion of creating, having the chance maybe, or looking therapy as a space that we could maybe co-create different contexts where people can have different sense of selves, or slightly different, or different conversation that could maybe continue in different contexts, and that suddenly they would note that maybe their difficulties is less or has dissipated, or instead of that, there are different definitions of themselves, broader. And the last thing I wanted to engage people in trying to do to maybe experience the intensity of this tremendous shift is to try to define oneself in a linear manner.
In a what manner?
In a linear, like, I started in high school when I was blah blah blah, then I did this, then I did that. Everybody would fall asleep within a few minutes, right? But if you start telling yourself to others in a circular manner, telling stories about yourself and how meetings impact another person and how it creates different possibilities and open space, then you find yourself in a trance, like you were before saying. You forget about time and you transcend possibilities. You bring notion of hope, that are things that we cannot maybe objectify, but when it happens, we all know that there is. And in our field, I think instead of fighting, battling against idea or thinking we have the proper intervention or the proper frame or the proper technique, we should really concentrate on, I think you were somewhat alluding to that, learning a methodology of contact. How can we contact people? And that's a very difficult thing because it's a thing that is in constant movement. And again, it goes back to how can we walk this walk? Are we willing to walk this walk with the face of, ethics in practice, the face of constant request to reposition yourself in a world in constant movement? And how can we accept to be in constant reflection, in constant reflexive movement with ourselves, to constantly question what it is we are doing without moving to relativism that is sterile, or dogmatism that is sterile as well. I appreciate it.
Well, for someone who's hesitant to speak in public, you sure are eloquent. And I appreciate those remarks a whole lot. It's really, really helpful in kind of fleshing out. And I especially like that. How to move with the person. And I like the metaphor of dance here too. How can I dance with you? But not simply because so we become a better dance pair, but because you can then do something else outside. And that's a difficult leap to make because it's sometimes easy enough to befriend someone in therapy, but it's not clear what the takeaway is from that. But thank you, that's really wonderful.
Would there be any other questions? Yeah.
I would just like to get clarification what you said earlier about Buddhism, because you said that through Buddhism we are able to deconstruct, that it's a step away from reality, and that Buddhism in itself is a deconstruction. But do you not think that we ourselves, as members of the same circle that we belong to, construct what Buddhism is, and that through language we are able to make a concept of what Buddhism is, and that the word Buddhism itself is a construction that's made through language?
You've got all the moves. There are various forms of Buddhism, and you can't speak for the whole array at once, but a lot of the people that I tend to work with who are less religious Buddhists and they are practice-oriented way of life Buddhists. One of the dominant ideas, not everybody has it, but one of the dominant ideas is most of the problems that we find that we're suffering from are built into the language, are built into the distinctions we make. As I mentioned before, personal failure. Now, personal failure is just because we constructed something as the good and something as the failure, and the failure is negative for us. But there isn't any negative failure in the world, there's only negative failure in a constructed way. So the Buddhists would say that all suffering is of that form. What meditation does, and there's some mindfulness techniques that are different, but meditation allows you to step out of those constructions, those divisions, distinctions, like self, into a position where it essentially they evaporate. They are, and I use the term deconstruct them because it takes all their meaning away. You realize the artificiality, the thrown condition of the language. And for a time then they do not mean in the way that you've got to live them. They mean only if you enter them. And that's the I can be more technical there in terms of what, let's say, Derridian deconstruction does. But it effectively takes away the logical connection of all words, so that no word is a full word, every word means or references some other language, so in fact you can't say anything that's ever clear or meaningful. Okay, well, there's a second part to that. Oh, yes. But the problem, and this is what my discussion with Buddhists is that they tend not to want to deconstruct Buddhism itself. Realizing that it too is a cultural construction, but it just happens to be one which can be very useful. Not because it's true, but because if you step into it, it does some things that are very helpful sometimes.
Thank you. I was just surprised to be here tonight because I was taught by somebody else and I didn't really know what constructionism was. And what I find fascinating, what I teach is something called sociology, which is actually, I start with my class, it comes out of Switzerland and not many people, English-speaking people have heard of it. But I start by saying that it's a study of phenomenology, so that people are just beginning to discover themselves and that words don't exist. So it's as if you come from another planet and discover your body. And then you discover other people's bodies. And it seems to fit in the same way, or what I understand of constructionism. Was that, and I just wondered if that was the case. So it's kind of working without words in a way to discover who we are and discover relationships. I would say relationships first with the body and relationships with ourselves, how our structures, how we work. Is that am I understanding it in the right way?
There is one family that comes down to phenomenology, gets into social phenomenology, where there's a somewhat more resemblance. But going back to the kind of phenomenology you're talking about, no, it paints a slightly different picture because it says, okay, something exists without any language, something. But the moment you do the thing which you call recognize in yourself, that recognition is going to come out of some kind of history of relationship. Without the history of relationship, there is nothing to recognize. That's the difference. It's to say, look, we talk about individual experience. It's just my experience, and yeah, something's happening there. But when I experience you, what am I doing? I'm not just a flat screen where everything's the same. I'm already tuning into eyes, for example. Very rapidly gender. I mean, it's like just there. Probably skin color, just there. Why do I tune into those things? Because of my cultural lodgement, relationships I've had. They're not just accidental. So you might say everything in my experience is coming out pretty much of a background, a relationship out of which it becomes something for me which I want to attend. And which also means I probably lose some other things, which would be really, if I have other relationships, I could attend to other things, like the color of their scarf, which is very unusual.
Any other questions? I'd like to see if anybody has a question. Okay. Professor Gergen, I'd just like to ask one of our Masters in Counselling students, Jayla, if she would just thank you for your talk this evening.
Hello. As Roz had mentioned, I'm a Master's in Counselling student here in Geneva, and I do try my best to come to as many of these conferences as I can. And I found it very inspiring that it wasn't just for counseling students or practicing therapists that I found something that they could apply in their practice. It was also for other people from other professions. And I think that the idea of these relational wings of potential can be very encouraging, both to us as practitioners and to our clients. So I wanted to thank you on behalf of current students and the Webster community, as well as Geneva environment as a whole, and to invite everyone to maybe continue the discussion over some refreshments.
Thank you.